He was Hollywood's golden boy, living in a mansion while filming his latest blockbuster. But when he met a man who had lost everything and tried to end it all, what happened next changed both their lives forever. Jake Morrison was 28 years old and had everything the world told him he should want. Standing 6'2" with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that had graced magazine covers worldwide, he was Hollywood's newest A-list sensation. His latest action movie had just crossed the $100 million mark. His Instagram had 12 million followers. And he owned a sprawling mansion in the Hollywood Hills, complete with an infinity pool and a garage full of luxury cars. But beneath the designer clothes and red carpet charm, Jake felt increasingly hollow. Success had become a golden cage, and every day felt like he was playing a character even when the cameras weren't rolling. David Chun was 52 years old and had lost everything that mattered to him. Once a successful architect with a loving family and a thriving practice, a series of devastating events had stripped away every layer of his identity. The economic downturn had destroyed his business. His wife had left him for his former business partner, and his teenage daughter barely spoke to him anymore. David was thin from months of poor eating. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had given up hope. 3 weeks earlier, he had stood on the edge of the Golden Gate Bridge, ready to end his pain forever. Only the intervention of a passerby and the bridge patrol had saved his life. The unlikely meeting between these two men came through a documentary project that Jake had reluctantly agreed to participate in. His publicist had suggested it would be good for his image, a famous actor spending time with real people to show his depth and humanity. The documentary, titled Invisible Lives, paired celebrities with individuals who had experienced severe mental health crises. Jake had agreed mostly to appease his team, expecting to spend a few hours, take some photos, and move on with his privileged life. When Jake first met David at the community center, where the documentary was being filmed, he couldn't hide his discomfort. David sat quietly in the corner, wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. His hands shook slightly, a side effect of the medication he'd been prescribed after a suicide attempt. The contrast between them was stark. Jake in his designer casual wear, David in clothes from a thrift store. Jake had prepared himself for this meeting like he would any other professional obligation, planning to be charming and sympathetic for the cameras while maintaining his emotional distance. The documentary crew had planned for Jake to spend just 4 hours with David, but something unexpected happened in those first few minutes. When David began to speak about his life, his voice was barely above a whisper, but his words carried a weight that cut through Jake's carefully constructed walls. David didn't tell his story for sympathy or attention. He spoke with the raw honesty of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to hide. David talked about waking up each morning and having to consciously choose to keep living. He described the weight of failure that pressed down on his chest like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. He spoke about watching his daughter grow distant, seeing disappointment in her eyes whenever she looked at him. He talked about the night he stood on that bridge, how the cold wind had felt like the first real thing he'd experienced in months, and how in that moment, ending his pain had seemed like the only logical choice. As David spoke, Jake found himself forgetting about the cameras entirely. This wasn't the sanitized version of struggle that he'd seen in movies or heard about in interviews. This was raw, unfiltered human pain, and it was more real than anything Jake had experienced in his sheltered world of fame and fortune. For the first time in years, Jake wasn't performing. He was simply listening, and what he heard shattered something inside him. The turning point came when David asked Jake a question that no interviewer, fan, or colleague had ever asked him. When was the last time you felt truly alive? Jake opened his mouth to give his standard response about loving his work and feeling blessed by his success, but the words wouldn't come. Looking into David's eyes that had seen the absolute bottom of human existence, Jake realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuinely happy, truly connected to another person or authentically himself. Instead of the planned 4-hour visit, Jake found himself staying with David for an entire day. They walked through David's neighborhood, a part of the city Jake had never seen despite living in Los Angeles for years. David showed him the small apartment he now called home, the job placement center where he was trying to rebuild his career, and a support group where he met with other suicide survivors. What struck Jake most was David's quiet determination to keep moving forward despite having every reason to give up. During their walk, David shared something that would haunt Jake for months to come. "You know what the hardest part is?" David said, staring at the sidewalk as they walked. "It's not the big moments of despair. It's the small ones. It's waking up and realizing that nobody is expecting you anywhere. It's go to bed knowing that if you didn't wake up tomorrow, it might be days before anyone noticed. It's the invisibility. People like you, they see you everywhere. Magazines, movies, social media. People like me, we disappear a little more each day until we're not sure we exist at all." That evening, after the documentary crew had packed up their equipment and left, Jake made an unexpected decision. Instead of returning to his mansion, he asked David if he could stay and talk longer. They sat in David's sparse living room, and for the first time in his adult life, Jake opened up about his own struggles. He talked about the loneliness that fame had brought him, the way success had isolated him from authentic relationships, and the crushing pressure of maintaining a perfect image while feeling empty inside. The conversation that followed was unlike anything either man had experienced. David, who had felt invisible and worthless, found himself in the role of counselor, offering perspective and wisdom to someone the world saw as having everything. Jake, who had been performing his entire life, finally felt safe enough to be vulnerable and real. They talked through the night about purpose, pain, and what it meant to truly live rather than just survive. As the sun rose over Los Angeles, Jake found himself crying for the first time in years. Not the controlled, camera-ready tears he produced for dramatic scenes, but real, raw, uncontrollable sobs that came from a place he'd forgotten existed. He wept for David's pain, for his own emptiness, and for all the ways they'd both been sleepwalking through life. David, who hadn't comforted another person in months, found himself holding Jake as he cried, both men finally finding the human connection they'd been desperately missing. The documentary was never released as originally planned. Instead, Jake used his influence to create something entirely different, a foundation dedicated to suicide prevention and mental health awareness. David became his partner in this venture, using his experience to help others who were struggling with similar darkness. Together, they developed programs that paired people in crisis with trained volunteers, creating the kind of connection that had saved both of their lives that day. Jake's career took a dramatic turn. He began choosing roles that had meaning rather than just commercial appeal, and he used his platform to speak openly about mental health struggles. His honesty about his own battles with depression and isolation resonated with millions of fans who had only seen his perfect public image. David returned to architecture, but with a new purpose, designing spaces for mental health facilities and support centers. 2 years later, their foundation had helped prevent hundreds of suicides and connected thousands of people who were struggling with volunteers who understood their pain. Jake often reflected on how meeting David had saved his life just as much as it had saved David's. Both men had been drowning in their own ways, one in material excess, the other in devastating loss. But together they had found a way to swim to shore. Their friendship became the most important relationship in both of their lives. David's daughter, seeing her father's transformation and renewed purpose, began spending time with him again. Jake, who had once felt like he was just playing a role in his own life, finally felt like he was living authentically. They met for coffee every Tuesday morning. Two men from completely different worlds who had found in each other the missing piece of their humanity. The lesson they learned and the message they shared with everyone who would listen was simple but profound. Everyone is fighting a battle that others can't see, and sometimes the act of truly seeing another person, really seeing them, can be the difference between life and death. Connection isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. And sometimes, the person who seems to have everything is just as lost as the person who has nothing at all. In a world that often celebrates surface success while ignoring deep pain, Jake and David proved that healing happens when we stop performing and start being real with each other. Their story became a reminder that no one is too successful to struggle and no one is too broken to heal, but nobody should have to do either alone.